If you elect me, you'll never have to vote again. That was the promise that Donald Trump, as then a candidate for president, made last year to a group of evangelicals as he, prepared to take over the presidency upon his reelection last fall. And ever since his return to power, we have seen him try to make good on that promise through a series of sweeping attacks on free and fair elections. An executive order purporting to require proof of citizenship to vote, sweeping attacks on mail-in ballots, uh, GOP efforts across red states to gerrymander their way into a House majority as the MAGA agenda, is outraging so much of America as the Project 2025 agenda that Trump said he had nothing to do with is bearing down upon us. And now it seems quite clear that the call is coming from inside the building. We know about Harmeet Dillon, who's running the Justice Department's Civil Rights Division, long the protector and defender of voting rights in this country, is now an election denier, using that division to drive election denial and voter fraud myths. And just recently, we learned of another election denier given a senior position of leadership here in the Department of Homeland Security. We know about this development thanks to intrepid and excellent reporting from Doug Bach-Clark, the reporter at ProPublica, the outstanding independent investigative journalism outlet that is responsible for so much of what we know about authoritarianism and autocracy and its growth in America. Doug, thank you so much for joining us and for your time and for your reporting. Can you tell us a little bit more about this investigation you did into the hire of Heather Honey, an election denier connected to Cleta Mitchell and the Election Integrity Network at the Department of Homeland Security?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me on. I really appreciate it. And, Heather Honey is someone whom I've been following for quite a long time. I did an investigation into her last year in Georgia in advance of the 2024 election, where she was involved in laying the groundwork to help a lot of these election denial groups potentially challenge a Trump loss. And so when I heard through sources that she had potentially gotten a high-level position in the federal government, in the Department of Homeland Security, overseeing the nation's election security, I was quite shocked. And I figured, well, this is something to really dig in on.
Yeah, and it's, of course, against the backdrop of these claims from then candidate Trump that he had nothing to do with Project 2025. Of course, Honey comes out of the Election Integrity Network and is mentored, as you reported, by Cleta Mitchell, part of the Conservative Partnership Institute, a central architect and author of the Project 2025 anti-democracy, anti-voting platform. And here she is being put in this critically important position of election security. And your reporting also describes how the Department of Homeland Security in the second Trump administration has very rapidly broken down a lot of the guardrails that the first Trump administration had stood up to prevent foreign interference in elections. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? And obviously, I don't think we know that much about Honey's direct involvement in those decisions to this point.
Yeah. So one of the great ironies of her placement in this position is that the election infrastructure that the first Trump administration built was actually, according to a pretty wide bipartisan consensus, working very well. So after there was Russian interference in the 2016 election, after, Russian hackers were inside American digital election systems, voting bases and things like that, and after, they were using social media and other things to try and affect the outcome of the election, there was, bipartisan Senate reports, there was bipartisan agreement that, we needed to do something to protect our elections. And so what came out of that were a number of positions and agencies within the Department of Homeland Security meant to protect our election infrastructure, especially the digital parts and the physical voting machines and things like that. And that, everyone agreed, worked great until in November, December 2020, when Trump tried to overturn the election. And the head of one of those groups came out and said, no, this has been the most secure election there ever was. These sort of myths about voting machines being hacked and everything like else, that did not happen. At which point, Trump turned against the institutions that he'd created. And so when he got back in on the second administration, he gutted those groups, notably the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Agency, known as CISA. And in their place, he has now put Heather Honey as a top official at DHS. So he's taken what was an effective, set of guardrails, ripped them out, and put in someone who has worked with people who helped him try to overturn the 2020 election.
Yeah. I mean, pretty staggering when you lay it out like that. We had Ann Applebaum, the global expert on autocracy and authoritarianism, on yesterday, and it's striking and haunting the extent to which this mirrors the type of tactics and maneuvers that we see from authoritarian strongmen across the globe. And it's happening right here, and I think we have to, really reckon with it. And without, reporting like yours, I think we wouldn't even know about it. So it's vital that we have it. And I'm really grateful for your focus on this, because, frankly, these sort of second order tier 2 officials that might not draw headlines from the New York Times or the like are the ones that are actually implementing this agenda. They're the ones that, as we see with Heather Honey, are connected to the dark money networks that are so effective at leveraging government power to drive this anti-democratic scheme. One dynamic that I thought was really important to draw out, and I want to ask you about, was the dynamic that this creates with the states, as the federal government under Trump and under folks like Heyer are getting increasingly aggressive in their demands of states for information sharing, data sharing, often under, to my mind, pretextual justifications around voter fraud and the like. What is the fact that a out and out election denier is in a role like this mean for the American people, for states and people that are trying to vote in their state elections and trusting that want to believe that they have free and fair elections when they go to the polls?
So one of the first things that I did on, figuring out that Heather Honey had gotten this senior position at DHS was I went to the states, to the Secretary of States, the people who traditionally have worked very, very closely with DHS to guard their cybersecurity infrastructure. So one of the reasons that the Department of Homeland Security and the federal government handled this task of guarding the election infrastructure was it's not really possible for a state like Arizona or Maine or another state to guard against foreign Russian hackers or sort of large scale enemy foreign actors. And that's why the federal government needed to handle it. And so for many years, the states and the federal government, Republican states, Democratic states, they'd all worked together. They'd all collaborated to make sure that American elections were safe. But I wanted to get the reactions of the states themselves. And so I talked to a number of states, and one of the ones who was most forceful about this and who appears in the article was Arizona's Secretary of State, who's a Democrat. And he basically said, look, this is really disturbing that Heather Honey, who is someone, who has, Arizona has been involved with litigation with, other states, including Pennsylvania and others have been involved with litigation against her. This is really disturbing that this person is now guarding our election infrastructure. And it makes us, the states, less likely to go to the Department of Homeland Security and ask for help were something to happen. And so you see this this really important partnership between the federal governments and the states breaking down as the Trump administration appoints people who the states don't view as impartial actors.
Yeah. And all of this uncertainty that creates and the necessity it demands for new structures, right? We're in a new paradigm. We cannot trust the federal government to protect our interests, to be acting in good faith as a counterpart to states. And so, really opens the door to questions, I think, about what states could do to work with each other in solidarity, to leverage collective power, to protect themselves against, I think, what is a clearly pretextual assault on free and fair elections in the interest of entrenching and consolidating power for the preservation of an autocratic project. And it's haunting, again, to see it all play out in front of us. But again, thank you for your work to help us kind of see it very plainly here in the Department of Homeland Security. I hope that you will continue to report on Heather Honey as she, now wields pretty tremendous power in this office, and would welcome you to come back anytime as your reporting continues.
Thanks so much for the offer, and it's a pleasure talking to you.
Thanks so much. And friends, thank you for joining us. Please don't forget to like and subscribe to our work here at Midas Touch Legal AF. I'm Alex Aronson. Until next time, please don't forget, stay mad, stay motivated, stay mighty.
Can't get your fill of Legal AF? Me neither. That's why we formed the Legal AF Substack. Every time we mention something in a hot take, whether it's a court filing or a oral argument, come over to the Substack. You'll find the court filing and the oral argument there, including a daily roundup that I do called, wait for it, Morning AF. What else? All the other contributors from Legal AF are there as well. We got some new reporting. We got interviews. We got ad-free versions of the podcast and hot takes. Where? Legal AF on Substack. Come over now to free subscribe.